I know what you're probably thinking. Yet another DMC2 video on YouTube. I know. If you're a fan of Devil May Cry, then you're probably tired of hearing about everyone saying just how bad Devil May Cry 2 is. This is a video I debated a lot on whether or not I actually wanted to make. Videos and discussions about why Devil May Cry 2 sucks are numerous in the internet, and I thought that by making this video I wouldn't really be saying anything different or adding anything new to the conversation. I thought of maybe just doing a full analysis retrospective about Devil May Cry 5, which is something I've wanted to do ever since I finished the game, and much more now with the recent drop of the DLC Special Edition. But there's a few things that I see aren't mentioned when discussing Devil May Cry 2, and at the same time, it's not like I do these videos because I'm the only one talking about these games, I just do them because I really enjoy making them. So, today's subject is Devil May Cry 2, the sequel to the critically acclaimed Devil May Cry, a video game that defined the genre and would become the cornerstone and foundation of its genre. With its action-packed gameplay, eerie and dark atmosphere, amazing soundtrack, and interesting characters, Devil May Cry still has to this day a very special place in my heart. So when I finished it all the way back in 2018, and it came the time to play the sequel, I was understandably very excited. I mean, it's a sequel to Devil May Cry, it can only be great, right? Well, let's take a look. Let's first take a look at Devil May Cry 2's development history, which isn't long at all, mostly because I couldn't find much information about it. After the success of Devil May Cry, and after Capcom began localization of the title in North America and Europe, that's when Kamiya, director of the first game, caught notice of Capcom having begun a development team for the sequel. Kamiya was never contacted to become the director for this game by Capcom at all, which really disappointed Kamiya. I couldn't find much about the entire development history of Devil May Cry 2, especially the identity of the previous director, which I wouldn't be surprised if Capcom and Itsuno, the new director, refused to mention it so as to protect their career and reputation. The important part is the entire project was a complete mess, with the previous director being extremely ill-prepared for the job, and so having Hideaki Itsuno take charge around 4 months before the game was supposed to come out. And the only thing they really had finished was the stinger animation and nothing else. Considering how close this project was to complete cancellation, it's truly a miracle that Itsuno managed to push this game into an at least playable state. This game promised to make the sequel bigger than its predecessor, with environments at least 9 times as big as the first, and that they are, but we'll touch on these a little bit later. New additions are a revamped camera system and a new female character to play as, allegedly added as a way to appease the fans that were upset Trish wasn't playable in Devil May Cry 1, and to make Dante more, quote, James Bond-like in nature, end quote. An important and decisive aspect of the development history of this game is that after Devil May Cry 1, the development team at Capcom issued some surveys to ask the players what part of Devil May Cry 1 they liked and which parts they disliked, with the difficulty of Devil May Cry 1 being one of the most talked about aspects, so keep that in mind as we go along. And, well, that's about all I could really find, honestly. This game, similar to the development history I talked about in my Metal Gear Rising retrospective, was very close to cancellation, and it took a miracle to make it stay afloat. But while Metal Gear Rising rised from its grave better than ever and with an entirely new and better direction, can we say the same about Devil May Cry 2? Well, let's take a look. First thing you'll notice is that Devil May Cry 2 utilizes 2 discs, one for Dante and one for the newcomer Lucia. We'll go with Dante first. The game begins with a narration of the general story of the Devil May Cry world, with the story of the battle between the human and demons and Sparta, culminating with the entrance of our protagonist in an admittedly pretty cool scene.
The Demon Slayer, Dante.
First thing you'll notice is that our boy Dante doesn't really speak much, which will become a habit, so get used to it. After a brief scene with our 2 protagonists, which sets the gears of the story moving, we begin our first mission. First impressions, the graphics are a slight improvement over the first game, with the most notable thing in my eyes being Dante's hair and coat physics. This is easily one of the best Dante designs in the franchise in my opinion. The environments in this game are also pretty great, most of them are very visually interesting and very distinct from the first one. But I've had a fair share of problems with a few of them, which I'll touch on later. This game marks the first appearance of many things that would become common for the franchise, with the first one of these being Dante's iconic Rebellion sword. Let's take a look at our moveset. We'll start off pretty basic, but we'll eventually get our full moveset like the previous game, right? Well, not quite. This game's moveset is weird. In Devil May Cry 2, there's absolutely no abilities to buy. The entire moveset is unlocked from the start. This means no different combos to buy, and no million stab, no upgraded stinger, and of course no new Devil Trigger abilities. The only things you can do is upgrade the damage of your guns and weapons and buy the usual items, like Vital or Devil Stars, or Orbs to upgrade your health and DT gauge. I'm gonna be honest, I'm so used to playing Devil May Cry 5 that I completely forgot about items existing in the previous games, and it's not like using items damages your overall rank that badly, but it's just that I not only completely forgot about them, but also never found it necessary for me to use any items at all. The way you alternate between moves is by using the direction stick while attacking, which can prove to be slightly awkward, but if you know what to do, you'll be able to consistently get the moves out. As Dante, you get around 4 basic combos, all of them different depending on when you touch a direction when attacking, with different attacks for a standard 3-hit combo, another one for an attack, moving in any direction, and then continue, and so on with different combinations. A thing you'll notice about Devil May Cry 2 is the radical change in characters' animations, especially the stinger. It feels like all of Dante's animations were motion captured and pasted into the game as it is. There's no real feel of speed or strength on Dante's attacks, and it feels like he can barely even lift his sword. If we quickly compare DMC1's Dante's stinger animation with DMC2's, you'll quickly see the difference. In Devil May Cry 1, Dante seems like he's zooming past the screen, you barely even see the frames in which he picks up the sword and when he's already in motion towards the target. Meanwhile, in DMC2 you can see exactly how Dante very slowly picks up his sword and thrusts forward, not looking like some superhuman guy using his demonic powers to enhance his fighting abilities, but like some guy who is just jumping forwards while thrusting a blade he can barely hold. And this quote-unquote issue with the animations happens with pretty much any animation in the game, including Dante's Devil Trigger animations. If we experiment around with the controls a bit, you will find a dedicated control to dodge in this game, which is unnecessary but appreciated. The option to dodge by locking into an enemy and using the jump button will no longer work, which is slightly frustrating if you're used to dodging that way. And since abilities are no longer able to be bought, your air hike is unlocked from the beginning. No magical demon energy platform though, this will be just your standard magical video game double jump. Shooting Dante's guns is not that different. You're able to alter the speed of the guns by mashing the button or by keeping it pressed, with the fire rate being faster or slower respectively. And a unique mechanic that I'll touch on in a bit. Dante's regular Helm Breaker is still available, however if you press the lock-on button when attacking an enemy in the air, you're able to do a series of kick attacks in the air, something that Dante was unable to do before. This can prove to be slightly frustrating on the first time, since many times I've done this move when I was actually meaning to use the Helm Breaker. But since the lock-on button is such an integral part of the game, it's very hard to condition yourself to just stop pressing it just so you can do a move that you were able to do before. And speaking of the lock-on, here's a very dumb feature they added. Whenever there's enemies around, you're always locked onto them. Isn't that fun? Well, it works slightly like DMC1's autolock when shooting guns, but the difference here is that in DMC1 you were able to attack in any direction you wanted while you weren't locked on. Meanwhile in DMC2 you're always locked on no matter what. The lock-on mechanic is integrated to such a degree that in this area, where these chimneys are able to be destroyed, even if I'm not touching any button besides the attack button, Dante will automatically turn to whatever is targetable near him and just start slashing in that direction. With this in mind, the idea of having attacks tied to movement direction rather than pausing makes slight sense, considering that Dante is always locking onto an enemy. However, this seems like a case where you're creating a solution for a problem that could have been eradicated in the first place. There are plenty of instances where there's an enormous amount of enemies that just swarms the player and Dante goes crazy with who to target. And returning players from Devil May Cry 1 will not be used to the idea of not having the lock-on button pressed all the time. But don't worry, luckily the developers added the very cool feature of being able to override the lock-on completely. By just pressing one of the triggers all the time, you can stop the auto-lock. This will, however, prevent you from locking onto enemies again normally, and if you let go of the button, it will go back to auto-locking again. Thank you guys, what a save. The combos being tied to pausing your inputs was a solid mechanic from Devil May Cry 1 that did not need to be altered or changed in the slightest. And while technically DMC2 has more combo opportunities and numbers of attacks Dante can do, they're not only tedious to pull off, considering the circumstances, but they're also basically impossible to chain together, seeing as many enemies fly meters away from Dante as soon as the combo ends, and Dante taking so much time to recover after the combos that the style meter completely depletes by the time you get to the enemy again. And yeah, the style meter is still here. If you don't know about what the style meter is, it's basically an invisible gauge that rates your style in combat, basically seeing how many combos you can chain together and how much damage you can deal. The problem is, in Devil May Cry 2, this style meter depletes very fast, making it essentially almost impossible for you to chain combos unless you have a lot of enemies near you and just spam attacks in any direction you like, or do whatever you can to close the distance between you and the enemy, or use your guns. We'll touch on the guns in just a second, but first, what about the taunt? In Devil May Cry 1, you can taunt enemies to gain style points and increase the devil trigger. Aside from being a cool thing to do, laughing in the face of danger, it's a valuable ability that will decide the fate of the battle if you know how to use it correctly. Unfortunately, for whatever reason, this mechanic is completely gone from Devil May Cry 2, and you don't get to laugh at enemies anymore, so deal with it. Now, about Dante's guns. This is probably the most infamous part about Devil May Cry 2. The guns being basically all you need to complete the game. And this is not a lie. From how powerful the guns are even in the early game, being able to win entire battles by just spamming the guns and seeing enemies juggle in the air, to a lot of times enemies being designed entirely around just shooting at them, because trying to hit them with your sword would be too inefficient, to entire boss battles being designed around just the use of guns. Sometimes the camera just sucks giant ass and you have no other option but to shoot at whatever you're targeting, because not only can you not see the enemy, but the enemy also isn't doing anything. DMC2 buffs every gun so much, it's essentially a third-person shooter. This is not to say that you cannot use your sword, and when you know how to use it, it's very useful and can deal out a ton of damage, and you can make some admittedly pretty cool combos if the enemies don't fly 40 meters away from you, but most of the time you'll be using these babies to solve all your problems. But what about the guns in DMC1 or any other game? Well, in DMC1 and any other DMC game, it is possible to kill enemies by just using the guns, but they're never powerful enough to be your primary source of damage. In other games, the guns also don't juggle enemies as easily, only juggling them in the air once they're already airborne. Meanwhile, in DMC2, bullets apparently just defy gravity and allow the demons you hit to start flying in the air. Guns are meant to be just a secondary source of damage to chip away health while you're far away from an opponent, or to keep your stylish rank intact while you close the gap. But DMC2's guns are way too powerful, even in hard difficulty. Going back to the first area of the game, you get introduced to the first couple of enemies. As easy as DMC2 sounds, it's actually pretty common to find yourself getting knocked back or surrounded by enemies that can cause quite a lot of damage, which most of the times is more annoying rather than fun. The environments in the game look interesting. I've always held this starting area's aesthetic close to my heart, but in some areas it's very, very uninteresting. If we advance a couple missions forward, and don't worry, I will come back and speak about other things, we'll find one of my most personally hated maps in the entire game. The city. I love cities. I especially love big cities. Cities are such a great environment in games, from horror to adventure to both. With their wide streets, giant towering buildings, they're just simply great environments for a game. In DMC2, there's nothing. Sure, you got the giant towering buildings and wide streets, but there's really nothing to warrant the amount of map space. I mentioned before how the developers intended to make this game bigger than DMC1, and yet they had absolutely no idea what to even put in all this space. DMC1 may have had a smallish explorable map, but it at least had stuff to do in it, and the areas that were basically hallways to fight enemies on or to get to other areas were small enough to not make it a complete drag to go through. In this area, you're gonna be running around a lot because of how big it is, or rolling if you prefer. And it's truly a shame, because Devil May Cry in a city environment is all I've ever wanted. That's why I love DMC5 so much, because it pretty much takes place exclusively on Redgrave City. And I want to love this environment, but it's just so bland, dull, and boring. Kind of like the entire rest of the game. There's just nothing here, nothing interesting. This is a pretty linear video game after all, which kind of segues into the next point, the puzzles. Going back to the beginning of the game, we'll encounter our very first set of puzzles and obstacles right in the second mission, with destructible walls that will block your path, and these blue orb things that you just gotta hit enough times and something happens, whatever the game needs them to do. It's never really explained very clearly. This puzzle right here is probably the most confusing and stupid one. You don't nearly have enough time to destroy all the orbs you need to destroy, but it doesn't even matter anyways, because by the end of the puzzle, you'll most likely have solved it without even knowing what you did. So if you thought that you'd do some Resident Evil style item scavenger hunt, where you'd have to return to previous areas to unlock certain things that were needed or anything like that, then you can just forget about it, since that's just never gonna happen. Puzzles and maps in DMC2 are super straightforward, and there's barely any of these blue orb puzzles anyway as it is. By the end of some of these sections, you'll receive some devil hearts for your amulet. These will grant you the ability to customize your devil trigger, which now has a set appearance instead of changing like they did back in DMC1, where the devil trigger took the appearance of the demon the weapon belonged to. Now, it's just Dante's very own devil trigger. These devil hearts can give you different abilities like flight, electric attacks, better healing, better damage, speed, and so on. It is never explained where these things came from or why Dante even has an amulet for these devil hearts, just like many other things in the game. Dante has a secret form that is not mentioned in any of the manuals or any of the files in the game, called the Magin form. This is unlocked when you go into DT mode, as your health is in the red, which allows you to transform into a very powerful form capable of annihilating pretty much anything in seconds. I've never personally tried to use this form very much, but it's very powerful and can deal tons of damage, including some special moves. Ironically enough though, simply shooting at an enemy with a ton of fireballs can do more damage than using the special moves or attacking. It's not surprising that Dante has a set appearance for the devil trigger, considering that there are pretty much no other weapons in the game aside from your sword. There's technically 2 other swords that you can get as Dante. One of them hits harder but has a shorter reach, and the other has longer reach but has less damage. But having played around with them a little bit, the difference is so insignificant they're basically the same. The movesets don't even change at all, it might as well be just a cosmetic change. There are different guns, however, and they're pretty varied, although you'd mostly be using your pistols. The shotgun makes a return with a special feature of having some unique animations after you attack and shoot while locked on, which is nice, but ultimately not that useful for gameplay, unless you count this move, which would make a return in later games. You can also use submachine guns and a rocket launcher that I've never personally used, due to the submachine guns being way too weak and the rocket launcher taking way too long to fire. Plus, a unique mechanic of the game is twosome time, which allows Dante to fire in multiple directions while locked on into an enemy and moving the stick in the direction of another enemy. With this mechanic becoming the gunslinger style for Dante, and some of Dante's base moves like the rainstorm with his pistols and fireworks with the shotgun becoming special moves to do with the gunslinger style. And Dante being able to attack while in the air, possibly being the inspiration for Dante's Swordmaster style, which allows Dante to do pretty much the same thing. The game also allows for gun quick switch, which would become a staple of the franchise and was technically implemented in DMC1, although it was very awkward and slow. In DMC2 you can just switch guns whenever you want. There's really not much else to touch on when it comes to the levels, aside from speaking about the bosses. Since the levels in DMC2 are just what you'd expect, except with less puzzles, and the enemies are really nothing to write home about. Most of them are just your standard punching bags, with some of them being slightly unique, like these golems being able to completely regenerate and poison you, or these sorcerers that will most likely attack together, shooting different elemental attacks at you. There's some returning enemies from DMC1 like the Sargasso and the Blades. Probably one of the most powerful demons you'll be facing are these goat enemies that can either attack you on the ground with punches and kicks, or fly and stay airborne while attacking from a distance with magic. The other enemies are very standard and really not that important to touch on them, like most aerial enemies that are more of an annoyance than an actual threat. You're gonna be running around linear levels defeating enemies and advancing towards your goal, and in the way you're gonna be getting these devil heart and solving quote-unquote puzzles. There are some of these red orb fountain thingies that you can hit to get red orbs from, but that's pretty much it when it comes to the levels in DMC2. They are very straightforward and don't have much stuff to do in them. So before we move on to other things about DMC2, let's take a quick look at our second protagonist, Lucia. Her moveset is quite different from Dante's. Although the way you alternate between attacks is the same, she does not use a sword but rather 2 short curved swords. And while playing around with her moveset for a while, I noticed she doesn't just do a single attack per input but rather multiple attacks, which is something to keep in mind when trying to string combos together. This can, however, prove to be quite annoying at some instances when you want to position yourself better or when an enemy dies and you keep attacking at nothing. Lucia doesn't have the same number of combos as Dante does, but she's slightly more fun to play with. She does not use guns, however. She uses throwing knives or grenades, and you can also do two sometime with Lucia too, which is nice. And while Lucia mostly has aerial attacks when airborne, you can do a sort of helmbreaker kick if you're standing close to an enemy while falling, which is a pretty cool way to maintain these two moves at the same time. She can also use a crossbow for her water level, and yes, there is a water level, but it's so much better than DMC1. In DMC2's water level, you're still in third-person mode and move around freely. It's still very boring and a drag to play through, and you have to fight a boss fight like this, but I'm getting ahead of myself. We'll touch on the bosses shortly. Lucia also has a double trigger, and the design is honestly stunning. It has a very angelic appearance while still seeming demonic at the same time. In contrast to Lucia's reverse Dante colors, with her hair being red and her main clothing article, her cape, being white, her DT has a white, black, and blue color palette, which works amazingly and creates a very stark contrast between this and her human appearance. Aside from this though, and the fact that she can also utilize different devil hearts, there's not much to talk about in terms of general gameplay features and differences. Lucia can also get other weapons, but just like Dante, they're just a short one and a long one with weak or strong damage. Overall, the general gameplay aspect of DMC2 is fine, pretty mediocre honestly. It's not a particularly good action game, and it's not really the most enjoyable thing in the world. Most of the times while I was playing through the game, and I played through this game at least 4 times, I wasn't even thinking about what I was doing. There wasn't a single instance in the game where I had to put actual thought or effort into what I was doing, even when I actually had trouble with an enemy or a boss. A lot of enemies will just stand there idly, some won't even bother with targeting you and will act like morons, and others will literally just stand still and do nothing at all. Let me show you one of the most egregious examples of how terrible the game is. This is the city map, which as I mentioned before is barren as fuck and has nothing to do on it. What do you add on top of a very boring urban setting? Enemies that don't move and can attack through the enemies just to annoy you. Alright, fine, but you can defeat them easily enough, right? Well, let's throw in one of the most stupid and annoying bosses in all of DMC, the Infested Chopper. This boss you can kill multiple times, firstly here at the beginning, but you have the chance to get away into the building. It doesn't matter if you do kill it because it will simply come back, and you'll have to either parkour your way up the building or just fly up. You can fly up all the way and escape the building, or just stay and kill the Infested Chopper one more time. It doesn't matter if you do though, because once again it'll pop up like it's nothing. The battle isn't over, nor has it started, until you reach a building after jumping across rooftops, with the top of the building being the arena for the fight. For absolutely not a single moment in the fight will you be using your sword. You will exclusively be using your guns. Already not a good sign. Oh, and the chopper can also shoot rockets, and guess what? If you get hit by one of them and fall off, you gotta climb all the way back up, as these little shits annoy the fuck out of you. The bosses in this game are as mediocre as the gameplay itself. While in DMC1 you had less bosses overall, these bosses at least had history and personality. They were enemies of Sparta and therefore enemies of Dante, and they served the main antagonist, Mundus. They had character and you fought most of them multiple times, so they made an impact on the player and they were very memorable. Meanwhile, DMC2 simply has monkey. The ceiling didn't even break. It's literally just a giant monkey. The bosses in DMC2 have no personality whatsoever. Most of them don't even have any speech lines at all. They're only there to be an obstacle to you and nothing else. You don't even know if they're associated with Arias, the main antagonist of the game, at all. There's absolutely no context or explanation given for these fights. They just happen because they do, and that's it. They even had to reuse Phantom from DMC1, and they couldn't even get that right. Phantom has no reason to be here, and he has absolutely no lines at all. He just appears and you kill him again, and that's it. They also thought it would be cute to add this Nero Angelo wannabe character called Volverk, which basically acts as Dante's recurring boss fight, although you only fight him twice instead of 3 times. He fights alongside 2 wolf enemies that are annoying as fuck. Great job guys, you're really showing me what for by standing completely still. If you don't watch out, he's gonna easily beat your ass up, then wait. What was that? Hold on. This motherfucker has a stinger move, and it's better than mine? He's got a fucking million stab too. Where's my million stab move? You can't imagine the frustration I felt when fighting this guy and seeing how he's got abilities that Dante should have had since the very fucking beginning. But this is hardly the winner for the most frustrating and terrible boss fight in the game. Let's take a look at the riveting Furiator's boss fight, shall we? Starting off good, I'm just kinda tanking the damage with my DT because I can, and oh, seems like I got knocked back. No big deal, I'll just stay here and his AI is going to break completely and just gonna keep spamming the same move while I shoot him to death. Great. How about the Trismegia boss fight where you literally can't use anything but your guns? This is by far one of the most egregious example of DMC2's overpowered and gun-focused gameplay, and it's ironically enough one of the few bosses alongside Arius to have actual dialogue, although what they say is not necessarily relevant or interesting. The way this fight goes is the heads split into 3 with each head having a different element, and the way to win is by shooting one of the heads that takes damage while the others don't. After a while they'll come back together, in which state they're completely vulnerable, and after a while they'll charge up a beam and separate again. Remember how DMC2 autolocks enemies all the time? Well, you can imagine how frustrating it is to have the autolock change who you're targeting all the time and having to basically destroy your fingers mashing the shoot button. Thank God for the DT, which basically transforms Dante's arms into miniguns. This is easily one of the most boring fights in the entire game, with Lucia's underwater boss coming in very closely. You can't attack at all underwater aside from your guns, so have fun with this boss fight. The only guns you can use underwater are grenades and a bow gun, like in DMC1. Okay, but are there any good boss fights in DMC2? Well, as a matter of fact, there's a few that can be somewhat entertaining. One of them is Nephastoris and Nephascapitus. This boss has a very standard video game pattern of attacks and openings that can be pretty fun to play against. This boss has 2 faces. In one of them it's a giant demon possessing a skyscraper that will sometimes leave its face open for attacks, and will attack smashing the ground or shooting electrical beams. After that its head will come off and it will float around following you while shooting beams at you or other attacks similar to Griffin from DMC1, with horizontal or vertical electrical beams. After some attacks, it will sit on the ground and shoot in front of it, which is your chance to attack. Another decent boss is Plutonian and Tartarussian, with the latter serving as Lucia's boss early in the game, and Plutonian serving as Lucia and Dante's boss later on. This boss has another pretty decent pattern of attacks. They basically throw their giant flails around, which leaves them open for attacks, although if you get too close they're gonna spin around and attack you. They can also summon other demons to help, but the fight itself is pretty hard to lose. It's still a decent fight. The only fight where I actually had to get somewhat serious was the very last boss against Argosax. At least against the second phase. The first phase of Argosax is literally just a bunch of bosses of the game combined into one, which is as obnoxious and annoying as it sounds. Even fucking Griffin from DMC1 is here. Again, why the fuck is he here? It's easily one of the most difficult bosses of the game, not because it's actually a fun challenge, but because it's just annoyingly difficult and makes absolutely no sense within the logic of the game. Luckily, I found a pretty fun exploit with Dante's Devil Trigger, in which you can make a special attack that summons a lot of swords to attack forward, but expends almost all your DT gauge. But if you simply deactivate your DT while the attack animation plays, it will still play out and do the damage, but the DT will not deplete. So just repeat the process and kill the other bosses in the normal way, and you get to the true Argosax fight. If you don't get careful, you can easily die a lot of times, and it's not a fight you should underestimate. The fight also has one of the coolest themes of the game too. I will say one thing about DMC2. As boring and dull as most of the gameplay is, the soundtrack is the one thing that has not dropped in quality whatsoever. Most of the boss and battle themes in the game are completely and utterly amazing, with Dante's Shoot the Works easily being one of the most recognizable themes in the game. The music in DMC always remains one of the best aspects of this franchise, no matter how good or bad the game itself is. You can be sure that the soundtrack will be full of bangers. The music in DMC2 seems to focus a bit more into the metal side of things. We can easily hear this by comparing Dante's very first battle theme, Fire Away. with Dante's DMC1 battle theme. Despite this, the music is still very reminiscent of DMC1. It's still very eerie with tons of atmosphere and sound effects, as well as some gothic remnants left in there, especially in Argosak's theme, which has kind of a little bit of everything really, from metal to slightly gothic to electronic. Lucia's themes are mostly electronic sounding. Her battle themes sound like the sort of sound effects and beats you'd hear in the background of Dante's themes, but without all the guitars and heavy drums. They're pretty good, but it's slightly disappointing they didn't give her some cool metal soundtrack. The rest of the soundtrack in DMC2, as in the music for the cutscenes and such, is pretty much almost entirely the same as DMC1. It can sound very beautiful at times. Very haunting and eerie. Or straight up heroic and uplifting. Going back to the bosses, other bosses I didn't mention are either below average fights or just simply boring and not fun at all. Like most of Arius' boss fights, which are a mess of a bunch of enemies attacking you constantly while you're trying to keep up with Arius teleporting all around the place and doing unblockable attacks. The only slightly interesting fights are against Arius' final forms when he's possessed and mutated, which I'm glad they did because it would have been pretty shitty of the writers to let Dante just straight up steal Lucia's kill. Lucia has slightly different bosses than Dante in some missions, mostly the final two, but they're generally the same, although Lucia and Dante do traverse different locations and their stories have different cutscenes and converge at different points. So, having touched on the general gameplay of DMC2 and the boss fights, what about the story? Well, let's talk about the story of DMC2. DMC2 takes place after DMC1. Originally, DMC2 was the last game in the chronology, but as of today and as of the release of DMC5, its placement on the chronology was changed to before DMC4. Not much background information is known about Lucia or any other character shown in DMC2, aside from the fact that they reached out to Dante to help defeat an evil sorcerer named Arius, who is seeking to collect magical artifacts known as Arcanas to release a powerful demon named Argosax and become immortal by absorbing their power. Lucia's mother, Mathieu, promises Dante to tell him stories about Sparta back when he helped the people of the island if he agrees to help. Would honestly accept cash considering how bad Dante is at maintaining his shop, but I guess stories about Papa are good too. Dante agrees to help not out of interest for helping, cash, or the stories, but because he just decided he's gonna turn into a Two-Face and flip a coin for every decision in his fucking life. Seriously, this will happen so many times in the game and will become his little thing that he does, and it's very dumb once you find out something at the end. So, we've got a pretty standard evil villain plot as well as a very similar plot to DMC1, with Dante going into an island to defeat a powerful demon alongside a female demon and companion. Lucia being a demon isn't really explained properly or conveyed properly to the player at the beginning. There's no cutscene showing her demon heritage or explaining it, like Dante's at the very beginning of DMC1 where he himself says it. The only way you know is because when you play, she just has a DT gauge and that's it. The explanation comes pretty early into the game, around mission 6, where Lucia confronts Arius, the main antagonist, who reveals she's actually called Kai, and that she's one of the many artificial demons Arius created. This moment is supposed to be really impactful and a huge twist, but we don't know anything about Lucia to properly feel anything for the character, or have this scene make any impact on us. If we go by cutscenes alone, the last time we see Lucia in a cutscene before she confronts Arius here is when Mathieu asks Dante for help at the very beginning of the game. So prior to this conversation, we have absolutely no knowledge about Lucia aside from the fact that she called Dante and that she is a protector of the island. We don't know what she's like, we don't know her history, we don't know anything. So why should we care about this moment when I don't know anything about Lucia? For comparison, we learn about Trish's allegiance to Mundus and her real identity as an artificially created demon at the very end of DMC 1 in the nightmare fight and the fight against Mundus. Dante's story sections aren't much better. For some godforsaken reason, they decided to make Dante a soft-spoken guy of few words that won't crack jokes even if he has a gun barrel pointed right at his forehead. A huge contrast with DMC 1's Dante, where even if he's fighting off against the king of the underworld, he is still laughing in his face and being an overall clown. And even when he gets serious, he gets very vocal about his anger and talks in a more strong voice. Meanwhile, in DMC 2, he's flipping coins to see whether or not the people asking for his services will survive today or not. In DMC 1, we get a proper setup for our story, with the story of Sparta giving us all the information we need to discern the motives of the antagonists and Dante's own motivations to seek revenge, as well as a nicely set up and executed twist with Trish being an artificial demon resembling Dante's mother. In DMC 2, we don't get anything like that. The game begins with the retelling of Sparta's story, and after that, Dante meets Lucia and the game begins. There's no explanations given, no proper setups for the story, it just kinda goes forward without really caring. And forget about the bosses giving any insight into the situation, or having personalities or motives, because like I mentioned before, the bosses have as much personality and character as a piece of cardboard. Sometimes it reaches a point where even Dante hardly gives a shit about whatever the fuck is happening.
Looking for?
Yes. Now we can stop Arius's ambition.
Whatever.
It's around this point in the story, after gathering the Arcanas before Arius gets them, that Lucia has conflicting feelings about her being an artificial demon created by Arius. She gives the Arcanas to Dante and goes to confront Arius on her own. As Lucia leaves, Dante gets an extra boss fight and returns to Mantier, who tells Dante to use the Arcanas to help Lucia, who went to confront Arius by herself. There are no levels in between this moment and the moment Lucia confronts Arius. Even though we spent entire levels running around the city from point A to point V, Lucia is just magically inside Arius's building dressed as one of her other clones. And wouldn't you know it, she gets captured and has to get saved by Dante, who gives the Arcanas to Arius, and after saving Lucia, they escape before Arius attacks them. After this moment, you'll have to explore through the previous Orvan environment, now distorted by the demonic energy released. It's a pretty cool area, although it has one of my most hated sections, where you have to fight off a lot of enemies in a certain time frame or else the portal to Arius's building will close. This section is super annoying because the entire area is divided by this fucking thing in the middle, so there's no easy way to get around the place unless you go all the way around the area just to fight off like 2 flying fucks that are all the way across the arena. There's also a humongous amount of enemies for how big the area is. It's just not a good time. When Dante returns to face Arius, they both fight once again, with Arius unable to completely release Argosax and take his power due to one of the artifacts being replaced with Dante's own coin. After Dante seems to kill Arius, a very dramatic moment between Lucia and Dante occurs afterwards, where Lucia is trying to get Dante to kill her, out of her fear of becoming a monster that will harm humans. Which again would be a very good moment if Lucia actually developed as a character or we knew anything about her, which we don't at all. And this revelation happened so suddenly that it has no impact whatsoever, since we knew from the very first hour of the game that she was not fully human. And even though this clearly upsets her, we have no reason to be upset because we barely know her. Not only that, but this whole character arc about having conflicting feelings over her real nature isn't developed in the slightest, which is the main reason why this whole thing doesn't work. Dante tells her the same thing he told Trish in DMC 1, and as the portal to the underworld opens, Lucia asks to go herself, since she's expendable. To which Dante flips his fucking stupid coin again and goes in himself, just like Sparta did before him, essentially meaning that the portal will close and he will have no way out of the underworld, trapping himself for the sake of humanity. Which, allow me to mention, is the dumbest thing to add into the story of this game. I mean, you have a boring plot with boring characters and boring villains, and you add the main protagonist essentially sacrificing themselves to save the world in that same story? The entire plot of DMC 2 feels like Dante just going to work. There's absolutely no emotional connection with the situation or these characters that warrants such an enormous sacrifice from Dante's part, Whenever you make such an important character, like the main character, sacrifice themselves for the sake of the world, it's usually after a very emotional adventure, after you got really attached to the character and or their group. But as much as I love Dante, this one just doesn't have any of that. He's got the coolness, he's got the fighting, but where's the personality? I'd understand to make such a big decision for Dante's character if the story nicely wrapped up almost everything and had a bunch of actually emotional moments between characters that are properly set up and developed as the story moves forward, giving Dante a nice end to his tale. If only there was a game that did something like this. But anyways, of course, Dante goes in and fights Argosax. While this is happening, Lucia fights a possessed and mutated Arius due to the power of the Arcanas. After a pretty heated battle, Dante finally manages to get the upper hand on Argosax, defeating him the same way he did Mundus. Just say it, please, just this one thing. Oh, come on, they couldn't even get Dante to say Jackpot, really? Anyways, after this, Dante gets on his bike, which God knows where he got it from, and rides into the sunset, I guess. Meanwhile, Lucia reunites with Métier in the aftermath of the fight, and realizes that Dante tricked her since the coin was identical on both sides. So wait, this asshole has been flipping that stupid coin all day, and it didn't even matter because he would have said yes anyways? What was the fucking point of the coin then? After this, Lucia goes back to Dante's shop and thinks about Dante for a while until she hears a bike noise outside the shop, and it's heavily implied that Dante came back somehow. I do feel like I need to point out that this is a post-credit scene, and it's a scene you only get on the Dante story and not the Lucia story. And for this reason alone, I think people should play Dante's story first and then Lucia's, because a lot of details and a lot of cutscenes get completely left out from Lucia's story. And that's DMC2. What an exciting, compelling, moving story, full of interesting characters, twists, and happy endings. On a more serious note, just like the rest of the game, DMC2's story is dull, boring, and uninteresting. Which is very sad for me to say, because I actually really like the concept of the story, and I really like Lucia a lot. Her design is amazing, she's pretty cute, and she's got an interesting fighting style. But the only problem is she has no character at all. The only slightly emotional moment we have is after Lucia defeats Arius, where she realizes Dante tricked her, and after Dante comes back. You feel like at least Lucia formed a connection with Dante throughout the story. But this connection shouldn't start at the very end of the story. It should develop throughout the story between these two characters bouncing off of each other, which makes it all the more sad when they eventually split up at the end. If only there was a game that did something like that. Dante is stripped of all his personality and is left like this stereotypical quiet guy, cool dude, and even Argosax, the main fucking antagonist, has about as much personality as his face. Even if Mundus was a stereotypical villain, he at least had a memorable and strong personality and presence. The only entertaining character in this entire mess of a story is Arius, simply because of how cartoonishly evil and dumb he is. Seriously, just look and listen to this guy.
I will become an all-powerful immortal!
Is there a problem?
You! No! My dream! My life! I was going to be the king of this world!
King? Yeah. Here's your crown.
A lot of people say that the story doesn't matter in Devil May Cry, but I heavily disagree with that, seeing as how the majority of the games in the franchise are pretty good or amazing at characterization and creating their stories, and whenever the story is bad, it's one of the most criticized points of the game. If the story actually didn't matter, all DMC games would be like DMC 2, which probably exists in another timeline and is the most horrifying thought. DMC 1, the very first game, has a very solid story with a variety of solid characters, well-executed twists like Trish's real identity and allegiance, and Nito Angelo's real identity being Virgil, Dante's brother, giving Dante not only closure on what happened to Virgil, but also giving him all the more reason to face Mundus. As well as a believable redemption for Trish where she turns against Mundus and decides to help Dante, who helped her before, even when she tried to kill him, showing that even a demon can feel, which is arguably the entire point of the first game, with Sparta's story revolving entirely around a demon falling in love with a human and protecting humans. None of this is present in DMC 2's story in the slightest, and again, it's a very sad thing, because I feel like DMC 2 could have been so much more, but we should at least thank God that we have a playable DMC 2, and that Itsuno stepped in when he did, because otherwise DMC would have probably been cancelled outright, or would have been such a disaster that nobody would have wanted to touch it ever again, even with the success of the first game. Now, having finished the game, you get some pretty cool unlocks and some stuff that would become, again, standard for the franchise, like the chapter select screen and the Bloody Palace mode in which you battle through a shit ton of floors full of demons. Another inclusion is the outfit/character selection screen, which allows you to choose different outfits for Dante and Lucia, with most of these being some collaboration with Diesel, as well as Dante's original DMC1 outfit, which actually looks quite nice and works nicely with the hair and coat physics. You also get arguably one of the best things to come out of this game, Trish as a playable character. That's right, after completing the game in hard mode, you unlock Trish as a playable character for both campaigns. And the best part about it is that she has the same moveset and gameplay as the first game. Yes, you heard that right, Trish's moveset is a complete copy-paste from DMC1 in its entirety. So get this. They had a fully functional version of the DMC1 gameplay, complete with using pauses between inputs to make combos and the different moves. The entire moveset of the swords from the first game, letting you do the upgraded Stinger, Million Stab, as well as Round Trip, which frees Trish to use her own fists and legs for attacks similar to Ifrit's moveset, as well as a Devil Trigger that keeps some of Alastor's moveset on it. They had all this, and they couldn't just add that into DMC 2? Do you have any idea how much more tolerable DMC 2 could have been if the gameplay was identical to DMC 1? It would have at least been as good as DMC, even if it would have been the same thing. They even copied small details, like Trish using a demon magic platform for her air hike, while Dante and Lucia just kinda jump by kicking the air itself, I guess. Finding out Trish's gameplay in DMC 2 was the most infuriated I felt, but after having played the game 4 times, I didn't have enough energies to care. And it's not like Trish's moveset works particularly well for DMC 2, considering the enemies aren't designed adequately, and some enemies are entirely long range, which can be kind of annoying. It's at least fun to play with, and of course it is, because DMC 1 is a fun game, DMC 2 isn't. DMC 2, just like DMC 1 and many other games in the franchise up to DMC 5, has a light novel as some side material to read. I haven't read it yet, but I know the general gist of it, and it has a very cool character named Vero, which probably served as inspiration for Lady in DMC 3. I'd love to read this and make a separate video on it. It's probably a way better story than whatever the fuck DMC 2 was. So if enough people ask for it, and if I ever get around to reading it, I'll probably make a video reviewing this story too. Now, ever since the dawn of man, there's been talks about remaking DMC 2, especially now with the market saturated with remasters and remakes of old games, especially Capcom. And since DMC 2 could really use some help, should it get the full Capcom remake treatment? If DMC 2 were to be remade, there's so many things that need to change. First and foremost, the gameplay. It would probably need to use the same engine and gameplay as DMC 5, complete with the style change mechanic, as well as entirely new bosses or completely reworked bosses from the gameplay to their personalities and character. And possibly the biggest change that DMC 2 would need is a completely reworked story, which is difficult to do considering DMC 2 comes before DMC 4 and 5, so you cannot make Dante too powerful or go through too much change, because then it would conflict with DMC 4 and 5's story. but it's not entirely impossible to do, and this limitation could actually give writers a better idea of where to go with Dante's character for DMC2, as well as the antagonists and especially Lucia, who deserve to have a good story and nowadays isn't even given a cameo in DMC5. The only thing she's appeared on ever since DMC2 was the novel of DMC5 Before the Nightmare, and that's about it, which at least tells me they haven't completely forgotten about the character, but I really expected something more. Maybe they really will remake DMC2, and if you ask me, it wouldn't hurt at all to make a remake out of this game, which desperately needs one. Many fans believe that DMC5 wraps up the story nicely, although everyone will love to see a DMC6. I think if they decided to chill on DMC for a while or permanently, and decided instead to make a remake, that would be a good decision. It's more DMC after all, and it would feel like a brand new game. So, after all this, is DMC2 really as bad as people say it is? Yes, it is. It's terrible. It's boring and dull, but we have to give it credit for introducing mechanics and certain elements that would become standard for the franchise, as well as praising Itsuno for making this burning pile of trash a playable video game, even if it's not good. Itsuno would go on to create one of the best DMC and best video games of all time in general. So it's a little sad to see that, at least for a while, many people would shit on Itsuno for being a shit director in DMC2, when in reality, he's the one that saved the entire project. Perhaps one day I'll talk about DMC3, but before I do that, I'd have to replay it multiple times, which would take a long time. For the time being, you can expect more animations on the way, as well as perhaps other videos on video games sometime later. With all that said, I think I talked about pretty much everything I wanted to talk about. If you don't know it already, then I take this chance to tell you I am mainly an artist, so if you checked out my links down below and followed me, that would help me out a lot. Thank you so much for watching until the end, and I'll see you next time.